plan or community benefits, all of these and many others are things that the board has said, the community has said, and the board has said, these are priorities. We need really strong plans that map out how we're going to make progress in these areas, and that will continue. Okay, I think, how about the next slide? So now it's time for Brian Rooney. Sure, go ahead, Chair.
I just want to share with everything that in a meeting before this, the county administrator branded on my forehead to keep us on the time frame that we have set here, because really, even at best, we'll only have 15 minutes. Steve, I think, you gave us so much information. At some point, someday, I would love to get to what really is the core of this issue, which is a true structural imbalance in receipts, a portfolio of receiving those that is so imbalanced and so enslaved by decisions that were made by generations before us. I mean, that's underlying everything. Now's not the time for that. So if I may I introduce Mr. Rooney?
Please.
Okay. So Brian Rooney, who's the state economist for Lane County, and who I would look forward to telling me that I'm incorrect when I say that all economists' projections are wrong, is going to give us his sense of what's undergirding our economy. And Mr. Rooney, I would be delighted in also hearing you explain your sense of the deviations. We all know why, between what you anticipated and shared with us last year at this time and what you're sharing now, sir. And commissioners, okay, I apologize. After every presentation other than Steve's, I will ask every commissioner if they have any discussion items, questions, etc. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you, Commissioner Burney. It's true that our forecasts are always wrong, but if we're in the right direction in magnitude, we feel pretty good about that. A nice introduction. I guess, Tanya, I'll just say next. What's up next? Yeah. So obviously a lot to talk about, but the two main things are the economy during the pandemic. Obviously wildfires, we have some limited information about that. And then we have new forecasts, both short-term and long-term. Next. Okay, so first, Lane County's economy is diverse, and I want to draw attention to the first two rows. That's private education and health services and government. The University of Oregon is in that government section, and 18% labor concentration in government is not exceptionally high for a small area. So to have a major university and not have a very high concentration in government is a testament to the strength of the private sector. Healthcare in particular, Lane County has become a regional healthcare center. And then we have our normal labor concentrations and kind of the local industries. But in manufacturing, we have a little higher concentration than the national average. So that adds to the diversity. Next. Okay, so employment and unemployment during a pandemic, obviously a big subject right now. Next. Okay, so employment losses in 2020, obviously sharp and severe. Lane County lost a little over 25,000 jobs, or 15% of its jobs in March and April of 2020. By November 2020, we'd gained back about 45% of those jobs. So a lot of the unemployment was temporary, caused by restrictions. And as those restrictions were lifted, employment came back, but not all of it. Next. So this is a little closer look at what's happening with employment, and a comparison also to the Great Recession. So the blue dotted line is the Great Recession back in 2008, the beginning in 2008. And then the yellow line is the current recession. And even though it isn't 2 quarters of negative GDP growth, the employment losses were so great that it's a recession. Again, you can see the large employment losses in March and April, quick rebound, but more recently, that rebound has slowed. Next. This is over the year employment, October 2020 compared to October 2019. Total non-farm payroll employment is down 13,400, or about 8.1%. So what this shows is the industries, and first the losses, and now how they've kind of come back and where they stand now. Leisure and hospitality, obviously the hardest hit industry, because that's where restaurants and hotels are. There were a lot of restrictions put on restaurants and bars in particular. Next is educate. I'm sorry, could we go back to the previous? I'm going down on the industries here, the industry bars. Education and health services. That private education and health services, that was had a pretty significant hit. Of course, education, schools had to close. And then in healthcare, doctors' offices, dentist offices, and non-essential health services were all pretty much shut down. They were able to come back once they were able to practice social distancing, but obviously they didn't come back completely. And then in government, the loss is almost entirely from schools, from the U of O and the local school district. And if we get down towards the bottom here, mining and logging, obviously no problem with social distancing there. So they had very small losses. And then construction is up over the year. No problem social distancing there. And also there's a lot of demand for construction right now. The millennials are entering into that age group where they have family formation, 30 to 40-year-old, that range. And there's been a housing shortage or less inventory for a while, and interest rates are near record lows. So there's a lot of demand for residential construction right now. Next. Okay, back to the diverse economy and how it can help you having a diverse economy in a recession. If we go back to the Great Recession, you can see that yellow line is manufacturing. And that was hit pretty hard, especially in Lane County. And construction, that blue line, was hit pretty hard too. But if we look at some of the other industries, healthcare just kept growing right through the Great Recession. And leisure and hospitality didn't take that big a hit during the Great Recession either. Now, if we fast forward to today's recession, obviously leisure and hospitality took a big hit, as did healthcare, but manufacturing and construction weren't hit as hard. So I guess the point is that when you have this diverse economy, different industries can help support the economy while other industries are being hurt during the recession. Next. Okay, this is unemployment rates. Obviously unemployment rates went way up in March and April. And in fact, we went from record low unemployment rates earlier in the year during January and February to record high rates. So Lane County topped out at 16%. Since then, we've come down to 6.2%, which really is not great, but it's not that bad an unemployment rate. During this recession, Lane County has been tracking pretty well with Oregon and the nation. Oregon's statewide rate was 6.0 in November, and the nation was 6.7 in November. In previous recessions, Lane County had a little higher unemployment rate, largely because our economy is a little more dependent on goods producing. in a more normal recession, I guess, goods producing sectors are hit a little harder. Next. So this is November unemployment rates by county. Due to the nature of the recession, counties that have a high concentration of employment in leisure and hospitality, for instance, the coastal areas and Bend, have higher unemployment rates. And also the urban area around Portland has a higher rate. Because they're an urban area, they've been facing more restrictions because of the pandemic. They were the last to have restrictions lifted in the spring, and one of the first to go back to being restricted during the second wave. So it's a little bit of a switch from what we're used to seeing. The eastern counties, which are largely agriculture, so manufacturing and logging, haven't been as affected by the pandemic as the western counties. Normally, western counties have lower unemployment rates because they're urban and have more dynamic economies, and the eastern counties have higher rates. So this is a little bit of switch from what we're used to seeing. Next. Okay, these are the reasons for job losses. So the green line are permanent layoffs, and the blue line are temporary layoffs. So, you can see in the Great Recession, most of the layoffs were permanent. This time around, most of the layoffs are temporary. But if we look at the past few months, we can see that green line is starting to increase, and the blue line is way down. So it's an indication that some of those temporary job losses are now becoming permanent. Next. Okay, and so another characteristic of this recession is that women are experiencing higher unemployment rates than men. Back in the Great Recession, manufacturing and construction were hit harder. Those are male-dominated industries. As we move forward to today's recession, it's leisure and hospitality and healthcare and education, which lean towards more towards women. Also, with that higher rate for women, there may be some child care factor in there. During this pandemic, kids are home from school, and child care has become a real issue. And some people aren't willing to go back to work if they have kids at home. Next. Okay, so this is personal income at the statewide level. We don't have county data. We won't have it till late next year, but we do have quarterly statewide data. And this this agrees with the national data, and it's going to agree with the county data when it comes out. So the table to the right there has Oregon personal income by quarter. And personal income actually rose between the first and second quarter. So in the beginning of the pandemic, personal income actually went up. And that's because of the government payments. If we look at the chart to the left, the blue bars are basically wages and salary, it's earnings. And the gray bars are government transfer payments. So you can see the blue bar is down, obviously people losing their jobs, but the gray bar increases in the second quarter, and it increases enough to raise overall personal income. The early indication is that those government payments really help people through the summer. Saving rates were double what they were before the pandemic. And then, when we look at some of the food and housing insecurity measures, they were pretty level throughout the summer. Unfortunately, towards the end of the summer and into the fall, we saw some of that housing and food insecurity increase. So hopefully the latest round of government support will help some of those folks. Next. Okay, wildfires. Next. Okay, so two tables here. The one on the left is acreage burned, and then it has the proportion by public and private. In Lane County, we had a significant amount from the Holiday Farm Fire to 154,000 acres. And more of it was in private than on public land. If we look to the right, you can see that some areas, the table to the right is establishments and jobs within the wildfire evacuation zone 3 during that 2-week period in September when we were experiencing the fires. Clackamas and Jackson counties had the fires enter more into commercial areas than some of the other areas that were hit by these fires. In Lane County, we had over 200 establishments that were in the evacuation zone 3, and it was a little less than 2,000 in employment. And it's an indication that a lot of what happened in Lane County, there is some commerce up the McKenzie corridor, but a lot of the problem was residential. And this is also an undercount because this is payroll data and it doesn't include sole proprietors. And we know that there are quite a few sole proprietors up in the McKenzie corridor also. So, that's pretty much what we have on wildfires as far as data so far. We'll probably be getting more definitive data over the next few months. Next. So here are just some of the thoughts, the possible economic impacts from large fires. Obviously, more negatives. We wish it didn't happen. The loss of homes and businesses and jobs. In the future, could be detrimental to tourism for a few years. People may not want to come take a hike in burnt forest. Could reduce population and business migration in the future. These fires were a little different because normally when we have a large fire, it stays out in the wilderness area. But because of the prevailing winds, strong winds, easterly winds, it kind of drove the fires down to residential and commercial areas. And when that happens, it makes the national news. So, people out of state who see that, it may make them think twice before moving here or starting a business here. Timber harvest levels in the future should be down. I'm not sure, how much available timber burned up in Lane County, but it's significant statewide anyway. The few positives, I guess, increased construction activity from rebuilding. As I pointed out before, there's already strong demand for construction, and this is going to increase demand for construction over the next few years. And possible increased salvage logging. I don't know how that's going right now, but from what I hear, it's a short window of opportunity. You've got to get on the salvage logging shortly after the fire. And I'm really not sure how that's going right now, but we'll be able to tell in the coming months. Next. Okay, now for the forecasts. Next. So this is a short-term forecast from the Oregon Office of Economic Analysis. The Employment Department doesn't do a short-term forecast, but here's the statewide forecast for the short term. So the red line is the current recession. By the way, it's called the square root recession because when it's put on a chart, it looks like a square root sign from math class. You can see, huge losses. more losses than in the Great Recession, than the bottom of the Great Recession. And then that quick rebound. What they're calling for is slow growth this winter, and I think we've seen that. And then schools fully open next year, things get back to normal, and the economy picks up and employment growth really picks up. The forecast that they have now statewide is that we're back to pre-COVID employment levels by mid-2023. So short, severe recession is what we're looking at. Next. Okay, and here's the long-term forecast from the Employment Department, and it's by industry. It's largely for training purposes, but we use it for everything. So first off, the forecast was adjusted slightly for the pandemic. We really didn't try to do long-term structural changes. For instance, people may be working from home more, or there are medical advances that have come out. We really didn't try to adjust the forecast for those things that were happening at the time. Actually, we had the forecast done and then the pandemic hit. So what we did is we cut back a few years of growth because of the pandemic. So healthcare and social assistance continues to grow. We have the aging population. It's creating demand for health services. Construction, as I said, has been doing well. Millennials getting into that family formation age of 30s and 40s. And also interest rates aren't expected to go up anytime soon. So construction has rapid growth there. Leisure and hospitality. We slowed the growth there a little bit, but also, once the pandemic is over, there should be a lot of pent-up demand for going out to eat and especially travel. So we should see pretty strong growth coming out of the recession in leisure and hospitality. If we go down to the bottom there, all industries are expected to add jobs. Information doesn't add any jobs over the 10-year period. And that's because there's kind of a trade-off there. Print publishing is in there, and so is software publishing. So we're expecting software publishing to have some growth, but we're also expecting print publishing to continue to decline. So there's kind of a trade-off there. So there's no growth over the 10-year period. Overall, Lane County is expected to add 14,000 jobs for 8% growth rate. And then even industries that aren't growing rapidly provide opportunities through replacement needs. Next. And here are the replacement needs. The yellow bar here is the growth from the previous graph, and the rest are replacement needs, largely from retirements. The blue bar are exits, and that's when people leave an occupation and leave the labor force. So that's retirements largely. And then the green is transfers, and that's when somebody stays in the labor force but changes an occupation. And those are increased by retirements also, because you want to replace somebody after they retire, usually. Okay, next. So that's what I've got today. And do we have a few minutes for questions?
Yes, sir, we do. Bear with me, commissioners, because I have 37 boxes and bad eyes, little teeny ones. So just raise your hand. I'll call on you to ask Mr. Rennie any questions you may like. Commissioner Bozovich.
Two quick ones, Brian. First, where do sawmills fit in on your chart of percentage of employment in Lane County? Are they under mining and logging or manufacturing?
They're in manufacturing.
That's what I thought. Kind of undercounts what the logging industry really does for Lane County. Do you have any idea how we're doing relative to U6 compared to the Great Recession as far as workforce participation? Have we lost a lot of workforce participation?
We have, and compared to the Great Recession, it's very similar. and it's been improving, but and I would have to look up the exact numbers, but yeah, workforce participation is down. You know, there's a lot of reasons to stay home during a pandemic. You know, it's childcare. You don't want to get sick. So some people are staying home.
So 6.2% unemployment's probably really much higher because there's a lot of people that have just pulled out of the workforce.
That could be, yes.
Thank you.
Anyone else? Commissioner Trieger.
Thank you, Chair Bernie. And I'll just mention, I just discovered at the top of my toolbar, I have a view active cameras, so you can put a setting in place where you only see the people who have their camera on. That just helped me tremendously. I just discovered that. I have
Thank you, Commissioner.
I have a comment and a question, and it could be for another time, Mr. Rooney. I appreciate your presentation. I'm thinking about Administrator Moka-Heiske's presentation and talking about, you know, the importance of reserves. And of course, when we're talking about employment, we're talking about people, we're talking about workers. And many of these workers, particularly, you know, after the 2008 recovery, many of the jobs that came back were lower wage jobs, part-time jobs, jobs without benefits in leisure and hospitality, in healthcare, the folks that are working in these long-term care facilities now, the folks that are the janitors in our hospitals and so on. And so at some point I would really appreciate a conversation with you or a presentation about an overlay of the wages of, because the economic activity is for the industries and the businesses, but the people that are working in these businesses and industries, and what the average wages and what the changes have been like in sectors. And then also particularly what you mentioned about, this is very much a gendered recession. Far more women are leaving the workforce for a number of reasons, including childcare constraints and lack of affordable childcare, and childcare workers leaving the workforce. Many of our childcare centers are closing, probably permanently. So I think just looking ahead, we're going to see repercussions of this in the future. Even if we see really robust numbers of jobs coming back, we're going to see in the future, particularly women aging into poverty because they haven't been able to save for retirement. And so on. So I would love at some point to talk more about the worker perspective and the wages relative to the different industries and as they're coming back.
Yeah, I would love to have that discussion. I can tell you that one of the characteristics of this recession is that it's hitting low wage people more than high wage people. You know, high wage people, a lot of them can work from home. But as you said, you know, we have frontline workers and people in leisure and hospitality that their careers are put on hold, and so it could have a detrimental effect going into the future on a lot of the people who are most affected. And I'd love to have that conversation. If you could send me an email, I can look into more detail for you, because I know we have some data on that.
Thank you very much. I'll do that. Appreciate it.
If I may, Mr. Rooney, could you give us a time frame for when you could respond to questions such as Commissioner Traeger's to all of us? Like 30 days, 60? When can we expect to see something from you?
I should be able to put something together within the next week, maybe two.
That would be great. Thank you, sir. Commissioner, question? I see none. I had a question, if I might. Mr. Ray, there was one of your slides that talked about job growth. I remember vividly seeing some Bureau of Labor Statistics federal numbers that are year dated that were a bit different. I'm going to ask you to explain the discrepancy. What I saw was that the 3 top growth job areas in the United States with fairly decent wages attached were 1, wind turbine technicians, 2, solar installers, and 3, home health care workers. Does that sound correct to you? And if so, where's the discrepancy?
Okay, home health care workers are going to be in that healthcare category. The wind turbine and solar, I think we're talking about percentage growth there. And boy, I forget exactly what industry they're in. So yeah, we can expect to see strong percentage-wise growth in those occupations. But total numbers, they're not going to add up to something like healthcare.
Okay, thank you, sir.
Or construction.
Commissioners Buck and Farr, did you have a question? No? Okay. I know that Mr. Mokrahysky wanted to make some comments due to a technical situation. So Steve, it's yours.
Thank you, Chair. And I just wanted to let folks know before we jump to Mike Coles that we are aware that it sounds like first 20 or 30 minutes of the presentation this morning was not recorded, that LCOG was not recording that, and so it wasn't available for folks. So we have some time. I think we'll get through this, and I think people caught Mr. Rooney's, missed mine. So, I guess you're welcome. Maybe that was intentional. But we'll do a recap at the end so that, just a summary of the things that we talked about in the beginning. So if you missed it in the beginning, just know that we'll come back and try and do a summary at the end. Okay. Thank you.
So ours is the opportunity of hearing you twice.
Exactly. You get punished.
Okay, well, thank you. And I'm sorry, Mr. Rooney, if you still are hearing, thank you very much for your presentation. And thank you for getting back to us. I think you said about 10 days or 2 weeks to Commissioner Trieger's question. Okay,
yes.
Next. Oh, hey, thank you, sir. I didn't see you. Next, we have our tax assessor, Mike Coles. So Mike, take it away, sir. We are not hearing you.
I see that Mike is on. And if we are struggling to get him, we could jump to, Chair, we could jump to Alex Kyler is next. I'm sure Alex is ready to go. So we can do that if Mike, and then we can work on getting Mike up and running so we can come back to him.
Mike, is that okay with you? Wave if it is, because we can't hear you. Okay. Okay, thank you very much. Alex, thanks for joining us now then and being flexible.
Sure, and if the slides can advance to my presentation. Okay, good morning, everybody. I'm Alex Kyler. I'm Lane County's Intergovernmental Relations Manager. Congratulations, Mr. Chair, on your recent appointment. And I'm going to give you just a brief overview of a couple of things at both the state and federal level that I think are important as you begin to think about the next year's budget. So if you could go to the next slide, please, Tanya. The first thing I'm going to focus on is the federal government. And one thing that's important for you to know as budget writers is that the federal fiscal year is a little different than the county's fiscal year. So, and that the federal fiscal year, while it starts October 1, doesn't mean they get a budget on October 1. So you'll recall the president just signed a bill on December 27th. That was the budget bill for this year. They've been operating under continuing resolutions for about 3 months. So that's not atypical, particularly recently. And it is a dynamic you should be aware of. As Mr. Rooney suggested, we've seen a lot of federal infusion of dollars, both from the CARES Act and now from this Consolidated Budget Act that was just passed. So that's really helped keep people economically healthy. We've seen a lot of money that has come down to Lane County through those investments as well. Now, the second bullet here, I don't know about you, but I've been watching pretty much all night the Georgia Senate race, and when I just looked, John Ossoff was up by about 13,000 votes. And so it does look to me like the 2 Senate seats that were held by Republicans in Georgia are going to flip to Democrats. Now, this has huge implications, okay, because that means that the Senate will flip. And in particular, Senator Merkley and Senator Wyden then become in the majority party. And they will have some very plum positions. We have not seen this kind of environment for probably close to 2 decades, where we've got really good leadership positions for our federal delegation. And I think that's got a lot of implications for Lane County. Now, the other thing is that we're hearing that earmarking may return. And again, that's I haven't seen that for, earmarking ended really when I very first started at the county. So that's just a nice way to get some extra dollars into the county for specific projects. The next bullet, and you saw a little bit about this in Administrator Mokraheiski's presentation. We did not see in the consolidated budget bill, in spite of best efforts by Senator Wyden, who's been just a terrific champion for secure rural schools, it did not make it into that consolidated budget act. PILT that's payment in lieu of taxes, and that's a particular program for counties that have a large amount of public ownership. So we will see some new PILT money, about the same levels as previous years, but we're not seeing this SRS extension. And so as you looked at that graph that Administrator Mokraheiski, you saw in 2016 and 17, when we also did not have a renewal of secure rural schools, how that actual harvest is just not nearly what the SRS dollars bring in. So we've probably got that to look forward to. Now, that doesn't mean that Senator Wyden will take his foot off the gas. I'm sure there will probably be other opportunities for him to try to get an SRS extension into play. And so it could happen in the next Senate, the next Congress. Now, the final question is what's going to happen in the first 100 days of the new administration? And of course, when I wrote this, the Georgia thing was up in the air. So you got to believe that President-elect Biden is breathing a huge sigh of relief, because he's got both chambers now that will cooperate with him. So it's probably a very good news for us. Again, in the Consolidated Budget Act, there was $160 billion that we were, not in the act, but in the lead up to the act, there was $160 billion that we were hoping for state and local revenue replacement that did not make it to the president's desk. I think we'll probably see that now come back into play in that first 100 days. And so, that's a large amount of money. It will depend on how it's allocated down to the local level, but it's going to be a new resource for us. So that's something to really watch. Next slide, please. Okay, at the state level, the governor's recommended budget is out, and any legislator will tell you it's really just a piece of paper and sort of a guide for them, because it's the legislatively approved budget that is really what matters, and they can be very different. Now, the second issue here, Ways and Means representation has really declined. We had some pretty good seats. In fact, a couple of years ago, Nancy Nathanson was the co-chair of Ways and Means. We now have nobody, literally nobody, on the Ways and Means committee. We've got a couple of people situated in subcommittees, but and that's important, but it's not like having somebody on that committee. And that's probably got implications as well for the emergency board. So we're going to have to deal with that. It's going to probably take building some new relationships with the people who are on the Ways and Means committee. I just want you to know there's a lot of state money that comes down to the county that I track as your lobbyist. Developmental disabilities, the state funds pretty highly. Community corrections and justice reinvestment are both critical for public safety services, as well as juvenile justice. Public health, mental health, housing, those are critical, particularly now with both wildfire and COVID issues. And then you'll hear more about the transportation funding streams. And then when you get to Mike Coles, he gets a lot of money through the state for A&T. And that's critical money for all the taxing districts. And we've had a sort of an ongoing issue with those dollars being adequate. Now, what am I watching? Ballot Measure 110 implementation. There's a few things there. They're taking some marijuana money that would have gone to the counties before and carving it off in much different ways than the initial ballot measure suggested. So there's that. There's some language in there about how they pay for ballot measure 110 by saving money from local arrests. That's going to be a little bit of a problem for us. So we're really watching this as it comes into the legislative milieu. And then, of course, how the federal dollars from the Consolidated Budget Act are allocated either through the e-board or via the legislature will be something that I'm really tracking on. Finally, in terms of policy, this intersection of the criminal justice system with behavioral health and mental health systems is a trend that we're really seeing at the legislature. Lane County has embraced that work. We want to do it. We know it works. The problem is it puts us at a great deal of risk for litigation. And so one of my biggest priorities this session is trying to find a way to mitigate that risk. And if we can be successful there, you know, it's all wheels up and we're off. But if we can't get some policy language to the governor's desk, I'm very nervous about behavioral health and mental health programming in Lane County. And I'm going to stop there and take any questions that you might have.
Do any commissioners have questions for Mr. Kyler? Commissioner Buck.
I was wondering what you may be seeing as the latest news in the next session regarding wildfire relief.
Sure. Chair Bernie and Commissioner Buck. There is, both in the House and the Senate, special committees on wildfire recovery. Remarkably, in the House, we don't actually have a member on that committee, which is frustrating. However, in the Senate, Senator Brzezinski did get appointed to it. So we're going to be doing a lot of work with Senator Brzezinski. There's some housing issues that we need to think about, as well as how to provide funding, particularly for ecosystem restoration work upriver. And so we will be having quite a few conversations with Senator Brzezinski about the wildfire recovery. There, as you know, Commissioner Buck, a lot of FEMA resources are there at play. And so we've got a lot of good collaboration going with FEMA, but it's a very complicated process and delayed. You know, it takes a lot of time. So we're working very closely with our federal delegation on FEMA issues. I hope that answers your question.
Are there any other questions? Commissioner Bozovich.
Alex, real quick, can you just delve a little bit deeper into community corrections and JRI and how the lack of funding the time study and ballot measure 110 predictions are what kind of reduction we're looking at there?
Chair Bernie and Commissioner Bozovich, I think you're going to see a little bit later in this presentation some additional information, but I will say, when Administrator Mokrajski said he was making that you all made targeted investments, particularly in the DA's office, one thing to really understand about both community corrections and JRI is it's funded through a formula that gives money to each individual county dependent on the number of people that are under supervision. So if the DA is unable to prosecute people effectively, it's just natural that we see that pool of people under supervision go down. And as our relative percentage to other counties goes down, so too does our revenue. And those can be very significant impacts. What Commissioner Bozovich is suggesting is that because of Measure 110, there may be fewer folks also in getting into the criminal justice system. And that has some implications then, because that means fewer people under supervision. Now, that said, I think we're going to hear a little bit later that the governor in her budget request has reduced the amount of money for both programs. That's pretty typical, and there's a heck of a group of us that work during the session with some key legislators to really make sure that that budget is adequately funded. There's some very interesting and wonderful language. I think it's great policy in the revised statutes that say if the legislature fails to appropriate enough money for community corrections, local governments have the ability to opt out of it. And that's a trigger that the legislature really does not want to enable. So that always helps us during the session.
Any other questions for Mr. Kyler? Commissioner Buck.
I have a separate question about housing. So we have a new administration on the federal level coming in this month, and there is some talk of some more housing assistance in perhaps a long session. I was curious what the latest is that you've been hearing about support for housing and homelessness.
Sure. Chair Bernie, Commissioner Buck, there's some new funding that we are seeing, hopefully for homelessness. And you're right, the federal package does have some additional resources for housing. I think the challenge for us is, and this is you'll hear more about this, but statewide there is so much focus on really trying to up Oregon's game when it comes to equity issues that we're seeing a lot of departments really wanting to change the way dollars get distributed down to local areas. And so there's more and more focus on how to get money to community-based organizations. There's no problem with that. That's all great work. But the question is what does that mean for county government, which has traditionally been sort of the linchpin and the, there's a lot of organizations in orbit around the county that we work with that will suddenly have access directly to resources. And will that upset sort of how planning occurs? And I think that's the question that the board will, and I will bring that back to you during the session to let you know how those conversations are going. But I think it's something we're really going to struggle with because while it may be good policy, how it actually works may have some real implications for our work and our sort of ability to financially project and plan for housing issues.
Any other questions? Commissioner Farr.
Thank you, Chair Bernie. And thank you, Alex, for a good and comprehensive recap of what we can expect in the upcoming year in the legislature. You know, your final bullet point, the intersection of criminal justice system with behavioral health, mental health systems. It's my impression, based on what I witnessed here in Lane County, that we are kind of leading the way in behavioral health and criminal justice, public safety joining hands. Is that a good impression that I have?
Chair Bernie and Vice Chair Farr, that's absolutely accurate. We for a number of reasons. I mean, we have 2 municipal courts, plus our circuit court. And so, we do see a fair amount of folks who present themselves to the court and they're unable to what's called aid and assist in their own defense. So when you look at our numbers of those clients statewide, we have a high percentage of those folks. Plus we have the Junction City Hospital here. So we have a lot of that intersection. I think if the sheriff were to hop in right here, he would tell you that in the jail, the percentage of folks with a real documentable mental health issue are upwards of 70 to 75% of the folks in the jail. So, there's a lot of work to be done here. It's great work. We've really got to elevate this issue though of how we're protected, because the courts are protected. And so the sort of the deep pocket, or the only pocket, if you will, that's available when something goes sideways is Lane County, and we've really got to protect ourselves there. State policy is pretty good with respect to the roles that we play with civil commitments and with folks who have been released into the community or who are under forensic care in the community who have been deemed guilty but for insanity. And so we've really got to just get this little piece right, and hopefully legislators will hear that and do something. And in fact, it's really both at a federal level and the local level. So there's sort of two different tracks that we're on there.
Thank you for the information, Mr. Kyler. And I would an interjection by the sheriff or by Captain Riley at some point regarding what we're doing specifically in corrections in Lane County. But it leads to my question. You know, we, in addition to what you've said, we have a mental health summit every single month in Lane County, plus behavioral health professionals, as well as corrections and justice professionals at the same table every single month, sharing their ideas regarding particularly diversion from jail for people with behavioral health issues. And we're pretty strong in that area. My impression is confirmed in that. My question then, Alex, is in the Senate seems to have eliminated their mental health subcommittee. Can we, as Lane County, be a particularly strong lobby there? We do have strong senators. We do have a strong presence on the Senate floor, including the Senate President Pro Tem being from Lane County. Can we increase our lobbying and potentially be effective in making certain that the considerations of behavioral health and the intersection with criminal justice are paid close attention to?
Chair Bernie and Vice Chair Farr, absolutely. And you know, there is an association of Oregon community mental health programs that's very well respected in the legislature. They've got a terrific lobbyist that I work very closely with. The mental health professionals around the state are very engaged. They know about this issue. They're engaged with it. It's a fabulous group. And you're right, while we did see the elimination of a Senate committee on mental health, we actually gained one in the House. So I think we're going to be okay with this issue. Like I said, the legislature really wants to get this right. I mean, you've seen JRI come into play under Governor Kitzhaber. Governor Brown really pushed what's called impacts, and with some new money there and that we received. So, you know, they want to get this right. They will get it right. And it's just up to us to make sure they're aware of some of the gaps and risks that are out there.
Mr. Chair, Alex, thank you very much.
Any other questions? Seeing none, just a quick comment, if I may, and that is, it seems to me that we're in midst of significant changes. Resources are going to be let at some point in a pretty large way. I think Lane County has some identified priorities and identified needs. I think Commissioner Buck mentioned some, Commissioners Farr, Bozovich. I would also put a plug in terms of the opportunity for renewable energy business opportunities to be an area where there's going to be a lot more federal support. And it seems like we ought to really be concentrating on, and we have an overrepresentation of significant people on the national level. Congressman Representative DeFazio, head of transportation, which means infrastructure, green infrastructure. Now, Senator Wyden will be the chair of the Senate Appropriations Committee, I believe. He has shared with us he wants to fund some big demonstration projects in the Western United States. This is go time, and I wish you all speed, and I hope all of us can help you secure dollars, support nonprofits, as you said, and demonstrate what can be done for the state and the nation. For whatever that's worth. Any parting shots, Mr. Kyler? Any further questions, commissioners, before we move on?
clarify, Chair Bernie, Senator Wyden will be the chairman, if everything goes as we think it will here in Georgia, of tax and finance and taxation. So that's not quite appropriations.
I apologize.
Senator Merkley, yeah, Senator Merkley does have, he won't be chair, but he will be now in the majority party on appropriations. And so when I said, we haven't seen this dynamic for about 20 years, that was the dynamic with Bob Packwood and Mark Hatfield. And so when you have a tax person dealing with the revenue side of things with an appropriator who's also powerful, I mean, it's, as you indicated, it's a pretty remarkable situation.
Thank you for correcting me, and thank you, sir. Are we ready for Mr. Cowles?
Mr. Chair, so I think Mr. Coles is switching locations. He had some technical difficulty. I think he's probably 5 or 10 minutes away. Okay. So why don't we go ahead and do unless he's with us and I'm not aware, why don't we go ahead and do the tracking areas of financial pressure, and then we can come back to Mr. Coles before we move out of themes. I'll just tee this up and then turn it over to Mr. Hurley. And I'd ask again, all the presenters here to introduce themselves, their name and their title. And this section is really to talk about areas.
It does look like the assessor is with us now.
Okay, Mike, are you there?
Yes, I did. I just drove in.
Okay. Well, let's go back then. Let's go back and do your section. Go ahead, Mike.
Sounds great.
Will you just introduce Mike for everybody?
Thank you, everyone. Sorry for the inconvenience of the microphone issue. Next slide. Everyone's probably seen this slide before, but it's really important to show, and Steve alluded to it earlier, as far as the amount of dollars that the county receives from our property tax distribution. 11 cents out of every dollar that we collect and distribute goes to the county, but the balance, the 89 cents, goes to the school districts, the cities, and the 84 other taxing districts. So that's an important note. And the amount that we get paid from other jurisdictions to collect the amount, the county does that per statute. So we don't receive funding from the different jurisdictions for a collection of the tax amount dollars in addition to the 11 cents the county collects. So next slide. This slide is important in that later on in my presentation, when we talk about residential properties increase in value, you'll see that the predominance of properties in Lane County is residential from the taxable value side, about 56%. Commercial is about 10%, industrial is about 6%, and then so on. It's important because as the residential market has been very strong, the commercial, industrial, and multifamily markets are a little bit unknown now coming up in the next tax year. Next slide. This slide is for market value as of the current tax year, which is for 1/1/2020, and the statements that were just mailed out and we just received payments for back last October, November. You can see that the winners, most everyone had strong increases in real market value. Again, these are typical dwellings. The city of Eugene right around 7%, Springfield around 10%, Lane County overall around 7.21%. And it's positive all around the board for residences. Again, this is for the current tax year that we're in. Next slide. This slide is just interesting. It's one that I keep up every year. It shows the last 16 years of real market value and assessed value for counties and the property for a typical single family dwelling. It shows the peak of the market back in 2006-07, and then the flattening out or lowering and decline of the market to 2012. And then if you notice, look at 2020 as far as compared to the peak in 2007, we're well above the peak in 2007 for the housing market. So it's just to show that we're in uncharted territories really with our housing values on the residential side. Next slide. So this is more for the upcoming tax year, the 21-22 tax year, because we are always about 18 months, about a year to 18 months behind as far as with the statutes for our valuation. So our valuation date is 1/1/2021 for this upcoming budget year, which we're discussing right now. Inventory is incredibly low, as everyone knows. If you look at the last 3 years, there's only a handful of years that are above or at 2 months of inventory. The last 4 months, we're close to 1 month of inventory. That's really unheard of. I guess a record for multiple listing. Real market values, according to RMLS, the average sales price of residential property increased about 12%, and the median sales price, typically that's what we use, increased around 14%. So the median sales price is now at $335, and even at that, that's really hard to find a good property in that price range nowadays. Next slide. So looking at two sides of the coin, as far as one is the assessment side, the other one is the collection side. The collection side, we were expecting a little more hit to collections this year due to the pandemic and the wildfires, but ultimately the amount that we collected as compared to November of 2019 to November of 2020, we're actually fairly close, a couple $1 million above, which is really surprising because we did expect a decline in collections for this current cycle, but we'll see where that happens, where that falls for next year. Next year is a little more precarious as far as for our tax dollars. Go ahead and go to the next slide. So some key dates, and again, these dates are really important because it's really easy to get confused on the assessment date, the fiscal year, the calendar year. For 1/1/2020, again, for fiscal year 2021, the pandemic and the fires had limited impact, if any, on the tax roll. For 1/1/2021, which is the assessment date we're working right now on our values and on the assessments, it will be impacted. I'm projecting a flat to slight decline in revenue for property taxes for pretty much all districts. For 1/1/2022, it's a little harder to estimate because it's a little farther out there. There's possibly impacted, but most of the impact should be felt this fiscal year, or I'm sorry, this upcoming fiscal year, 21-22. Some districts, again, will be impacted more than others. Some districts, such as the wildfire area, not only do they have the decrease due to the pandemic, but obviously with 500 some odd structures destroyed, those are coming off the tax roll, and they won't come off. They'll come off for 2021, 21-22. We're doing prorations for 2021 or 2021, but those will be off tax roll for a long period of time, and so the districts are going to be hit pretty hard this upcoming year. Go ahead and go next slide. So commercial, industrial, and multifamily. It's really too early for definitive adjustments. We're still doing analysis. We're still confirming transactions. Certain sectors may see decreases in real market value, such as the restaurant industry, airlines, hotels, apartments potentially. However, there is a pretty wide real market value gap between real market value and your maximum assessed value, or as you see it on your tax statement, your assessed value. So for most properties, even if they see a 20-30% decline in value, it's not going to have a substantial impact on their tax revenue besides maybe more compression. But for certain properties that are taxed at their real market value, which is with the maximum assessed value being their real market value, it'll have a direct decrease in the tax dollars received. State appraised accounts are already starting to see some indication from the state regarding airlines with the decreased routes even before the pandemic started. And it'll be, the state appraised accounts are typically, the machinery and equipment are above $1 million, and they're very high value accounts. So as we get those returns in from the state, it'll be interesting to see how the state arrives at their adjustments, and if there is a strong downward adjustment, or if it's kept flat, or if possibly some areas are increasing. I suspect most areas will be kept flat or decrease for this upcoming year. Personal property accounts, a lot of the small businesses, we just sent out our returns. We're getting an increased number of mail returned to us because no one's at the business. They've shut down. It will be a direct impact, not a huge amount of dollars, because personal property is only at the most a couple percent of the tax roll, but it does indicate as far as how the state of the local business economy is when you do have numerous businesses, small businesses that have shut down. The area that I'm worried about the most is appeals, and so far we've seen some appeals start for this current tax year for our BOPTA season, but again, that's a limited impact for next year. I suspect that we'll see a substantial number of appeals increase, not on the residential side again, but it'll be more on the commercial, industrial, multifamily side. It's too soon to say if they'll have merit or not. We have to do our analysis, but I suspect we'll see a substantial increase in appeals for this next upcoming fiscal year. Go ahead and go to the next slide. I think that might be it. Sorry I did it pretty quick there, but I'm catching my breath still from zooming into the office here. Any questions?
Commissioner Trieger.
I have a very simple, quick question just for clarification. When you say multifamily, is that quite literal? A duplex is multifamily, or is there a certain number of units that triggers it being referred to as multifamily? Thank you.
Traditionally, a multifamily would be 5 units and more on the same tax lot or on a same economic unit. And so the duplex, triplex, fourplexes more fall in the residential market.
Thank you.
Commissioner Bozievich.
Hey, Mike. I realized that the property loss due to the Holiday Farm fire was probably a relatively small percentage of the total assessed value of Lane County. But how is that going to impact some of the districts that is actually a fairly large percentage? Has there been a lot of adjustment downward for property taxes for fire losses?
Good question. There's 2 areas of adjustment. One's a proration of property taxes for the current tax year, and that's just a strict, or kind of is a strict allocation of the taxes based on when the properties were destroyed or damaged. I've been in contact with the fire chiefs and other districts up to McKenzie to keep them informed. And it's, they're going to see, I think one of the districts was at 26% loss in value. Other one was around 7%. Other one was around 8%. And that's loss in assessed value. And so that translates into pretty significant losses in taxable dollars. And depending on when these properties are rebuilt, it might be 3 or 4 years before these are rebuilt, or possibly never in some cases. Those are permanent losses to the tax roll that we won't see those dollars again.
Further questions? I'm sorry, I see you, Commissioner Buck.
I had a question about the multifamily stuff as well, because there's still in the housing and commercial real estate market strong sales for multifamily. Now, are you expecting some decrease because of people having a hard time paying rent? Or is it something else that you're anticipating from that particular segment of the industry?
Well, when we do the valuation of property, we look at three approaches to value. One's the cost approach, one's the income approach, and one's the sales approach. And they're reconciled together typically. The cost approach is not used very much as far as it's more the income approach and the sales approach for multifamily properties and commercial properties. So the income received for those properties has been impacted by two areas. One is the governmental restrictions placed on by the state for rent control in the prior year, and then the lack of rent receipts. We're still analyzing the sales, so we're looking at what's happening in the multifamily area, and when we finish the analysis, it may come down at the end where it is flat or a slight increase, but when we reconcile the income approach, which is a strong indicator of value in addition to the sales approach, I suspect that with a rent collection loss will indicate a potential decline in values for those properties. But again, we're still in the analysis phase for those properties, and I'm hoping with the state's fund that was set up to pay 80% of the lost revenue for landlords, that'll help the market out on the income side, and the sales approach will pull forward, and we'll see flat or increasing values. But correct, but there aren't really a lot of big sales for large multifamily properties. And so we may only be working off a sales listing of maybe 15 properties countywide for really large properties of multifamily, 10 properties maybe at the most sometimes. And so we have limited data. That's why we typically also have to look at the income approach too, as far as for valuing these properties.
Vice Chair Farr, I have been told that I've missed your hand, and I apologize, sir.
You have a lot to look at, Chair Bernie. Thank you very much. And Mr. Coles, thanks. You know, I find your presentations and your analysis fascinating. Some of the most fascinating presentations we ever receive are what you give. You know, I know that a lot of the numbers are kind of mind-numbing to people, but can you step back to the bar graph that shows the cost of housing? The historical cost of housing, which showed a dip in 2012 and a dramatic increase in the last couple of years. Yeah.
Right before this one here, I think, or before this one.
The actual bar graph, not that one. The actual the bar graph showing annual year by year. That one right there, yeah.
Oh,
now we have the last one was the one I was looking at, and it's not particularly important to what I have to say, but this is probably my best opportunity to say something that I say quite often, and I'm not the only one that says it. As a Board of County Commissioners, we have a goal of making it easier for people to get into housing, whether it be rental housing, even if it's emergency or transitional housing, it's our goal to get people into housing. If you look at that graph, we've not done a very good job, or we locally, it's not been a very effective job of keeping the cost of housing down. Now, there are multiple factors involved in that, but the fact is, if you own a home or if you're servicing a mortgage, that graph is wonderful news, because you feel a lot richer than you felt back in 2012, excuse me, because your property, your investment is increasing value. But if you're renting, or if you're trying to get into a home, that's horrible news. That makes it all the more difficult for people to get into housing. And a question for you, Mike, that you probably can't really answer. Why has the cost gone up so much between 2012 and today? I know there are multiple factors, and you don't need to answer that right now. You maybe give us a written response to that. But the fact is, increasingly, it is more difficult for people to get into housing at any level in Lane County, whether it's home ownership, emergency, or transitional housing. Is increasingly more difficult. And just to underscore the goal that we have as a board of county commissioners, we have to at all times be conscious of what we do and how it affects the cost of housing and the ability of people to get into housing, decent places to sleep at night. Mike, thanks very much. And if you would just give an analysis of what the cost of what's called a dramatic increase, and it can be in written form. The subsequent
I can give a quick 30-second response to that if that works.
With the chair, yes. I don't.
That's fine.
Okay, thank you. Supply and demand, and the supply is, as indicated by the inventory, is incredibly low. When someone's going out looking for properties, especially in the $200,000 to $300,000 range, there's very little out there. And as the interest rates are historically very low, I think we hit a very low point last couple weeks ago. It drives up the purchasing power for property owners or potential property owners. And so as the competition for those properties revs up and the interest rates are low, people can afford to buy a more affordable house, not affordable, more expensive house. But the interest rates aren't going to be down low forever. We can only keep them at the low 2-3% level for only so long. I think the typical 30-year rate last time I checked was, when I looked for a refinance, it was right around 3.5%, somewhere in the range 3.25%.
Thank you, Brendan, Bill, and thanks, Mike, for that.
Are there any more questions for Mr.
One more thing.
Oh, I'm sorry. Are you not through?
I'm getting intermittent audio, but Mr. Cole's response is consistent with what I understood. Thank you very much.
Other questions? I would also, my quick question that is, as when places are built, you then assess you then aren't limited, right? You can then assess at the real market or at the higher market value than you can for places that are 20 or 30 years old?
With Ballot Measure 50, most of the older properties were assessed at the 95 value minus 10%. However,
for new properties,
the new properties go through what's called a changed property ratio. And that's the typical ratio of values to real market value to maximum assessed value for each property type. So, for example, if a residence is put on the tax roll this year, the ratio is right around, I think is right in the 70% range. And so they do receive the benefit of Measure 50. And so the new houses and commercial properties, industrial properties do receive the benefit of Measure 4750. And so those are placed on the tax roll with a decreased assessed value as compared to the real market value.
I know we're running just a couple more things. I think one reason we're going to keep experiencing this insane inflation of housing costs relate to where people are moving here from. And to give you an example, the average price of a house in San Mateo, California County is $1.8 million. The average price of a single family home in Santa Clara is $1.5 million. And as long as we have an exodus from that state to this state, with that kind of demand coming in, I think we are going to be dealing with this issue and needing to develop creative solutions really quick. My quick question, another question to you, sir, as someone that's developed and closed what are called commercial PACE, property assessed clean energy transactions in California with my business. I would like to know why tax assessors in Oregon are against enabling that to occur here in Oregon.
Do you have 30 minutes?
No, we don't. So I guess that would be a private discussion. I would like to make the point, though, that it's something that I'm going to be questioning as we move forward. Okay.
Bottom line is it puts an assessment on the tax roll that's super priority. And there are some issues involved with that as far as well documented issues. It kind of has a black eye in Oregon. And I'm open to ideas and thoughts, as all assessors, of course, are. But the history of it is not a strong history in Oregon.
Correct. There is almost no history in Oregon, and other states have developed workarounds. So I'm sorry to take the board's time on that. But Mr. Coles, thank you very, very much. Did I miss anyone's questions? I'm sorry, before we move on. And Mr. Coles, were there any final remarks you wanted to make before we move on?
No, I just wanted to say thank you to everyone for your time.
Thank you very much.
Okay, Chair, do you want me to take it here? And we're a little behind, so we'll try to make up some time as we go through. This section is really to focus on highlighting a few of the revenue and expense pressures and challenges that we are particularly concerned about going ahead. So it's not a comprehensive list, but it's just to flag a few of these areas. So we have a number of presenters. I'll turn it over to Dan Hurley to start off.
All right, good morning, commissioners. I'll try to move quickly because I know we're running behind, and perhaps we can do questions at the end of this section instead of all of the speakers. So the impacts of COVID and wildfire has placed strain on most of the funds in public works, but I wanted to highlight two areas where we've seen the most significant impacts to revenues. And those are the Oregon highway revenues, which support our road fund, and the Land Event Center. So it's important to note that the state highway fund transportation revenue is the main source of revenue for the road fund and provides over 70% of road fund operating revenue. So with more people staying home because of the pandemic, there are less people driving, there's less gas tax, so less money to support the state highway fund. So we're definitely seeing that. In 1819, if you look at the graph, we saw a pretty good bump, and that was due to the implementation of the state highway, the state's transportation package. And we were expecting that trend to continue to see an increase with that blue line. But then, of course, COVID happened and caught us off guard here. So 1920, we, through the supplemental process, Supplemental 4 adjusted downward 2.2 million to match actuals. And as that was the spring and we were in the budget process for 2021, we again reduced budget by $2.7 million to match ODOT's revenue forecast. And we will continue as we move into the current budget year to match to ODOT's revenue forecast, but given the great uncertainty around COVID and implementation of a vaccine and recovery, ODOT has said that the outlook remains very much uncertain. So we'll be dealing with that as we formulate our budgets. It's important to note that with these revenues decreasing, our operational costs have been increasing with personnel costs. And so we are looking at being structurally imbalanced right now and having to reduce our reserves. The other major area of concern is the Land Event Center. Of course, with the inability to gather, they've essentially been shut down. Prior to the freeze, there's the bullet where events were restricted to 100 guests inside and 250 outside. Since the freeze, there haven't been any events except for the drive-through Christmas light event. And these projections were actually made on prior to the freeze. So we may be looking at a more bleak situation. But looking at the graph here, the blue line is 1819, that's sort of our normal year. And then 1920, you can start seeing the impact in the May, June, and then into the 2021 year, the green line, you can see major drop. We didn't have a fair this year for the first time since 1859, and it's made planning difficult for the current year and looking ahead. Not sure if we'll be able to have a fair this year. Of course, Land Event Center showed itself to be a huge community resource through these events. In the beginning of the pandemic, hosting sheltering for our unhoused during the wildfires, providing spaces for air quality respite, and providing spaces for our community to interact with the wildfire survivors. So our staff has really stepped up to these challenges, but looking ahead, we're seeing major impacts and having to dip into revenues to cover that in the Land Event Center. And it's also important to note that it's not just the Land Event Center budget. We're looking at $1.5 million impact by the end of this fiscal year. But that expands to a community impact with the hundreds of events that they host throughout the year. Big impacts to the community, estimated at about $30 million, with all the businesses, vendors, hobbyists that use the facility, as well as nonprofits that use the facility for their fundraising events. So a big impact all around. And I'll move on to, that concludes my piece. I'll be followed by Greg Rickoff, Director of Operations. And sorry, I didn't introduce myself. I'm Dan Hurley, Public Works Director.
Oh, all right, thank you. Greg Rickoff, Director of Operations. I won't belabor this. We've had a chance to have the conversation on this a little bit. We're paying careful attention to the supervision budget, what's happening in parole and probation. We did note that the governor's recommended budget has some pretty significant proposed cuts there, 24.5 million statewide. With the formula that is in play for measuring supervision, we are currently at about 10% of the overall budget. So that does mean a 2.4% cut in the grant and aid. With the 10 million cut in justice reinvestment, that's likely to be a $1 million reduction for Lane County. Over the years, this has been the case where the governor's recommended budget has come in very low. And as it was mentioned by Alex, there's a robust lobbying effort and folks pay very careful attention to this. So we do expect these numbers to change for the better. The question is how much. We're seeing that there's both state and local reduction for those under supervision. So it's likely that those numbers will go down some, or they won't be as drastic, but they'll still go down. You mentioned Ballot Measure 110. We don't know what to expect, and at the risk of quoting the district attorney while she's listening and on the line, it's rare that substance abuse is the only factor involved in an arrest. So we don't know if that number is going to change significantly. We also have some additions in resources for domestic violence misdemeanors. If that's the case in our numbers track, that the district attorney's been remarkable at prosecuting domestic violence crimes in general, but she's gone after misdemeanors as well. There's probably about 180 cases on average that might receive supervision dollars due to that change. So we're paying attention to the hydraulics, and you'll be hearing much more from the Public Safety Coordinating Council. Commissioner Bosevich, of course, is the vice chair of that body, and we will keep you informed. With that, I think we'll move on.
All right, I think I'm up next. I'm Karen Gaffney. I'm the Director for County Health and Human Services. And before I jump into the specific examples on the slides, I just wanted to make a couple general comments. As you know, Health and Human Services is both a very large budget, but also really covers a diverse number and types of services. So we have a variety of drivers that are impacting our budget, both in current year and into next year. So we'll do much of a deeper dive when we get to Budget Committee about that. But I do think it's important for this conversation to acknowledge that Health and Human Services has really been at the front of the county's response to the COVID pandemic. So that has impacted our budget significantly, both in terms of the public health response, but also a lot of the human services response. So you will see those impacts in our budget as we walk through this. And the other piece around COVID is that it has created, not only in Health and Human Services, but across the community, significant disruption. As you know, we've sent hundreds of workers home to work remotely, and we've been spending a lot of time thinking about how do we best bring people back, and what's the structural underpinning that we need to have in Health and Human Services as we move through recovery and think about what we will look like moving into the future. So you can also expect, as we work through our budget preparation and presentation, some structural changes that we'll be looking at in the department particularly in areas of the community health center, behavioral health, lane care, to help create an environment that really supports the department and our sustainability moving forward. So that's just a little teaser for conversations to come. So in these particular slides, we started with the community health centers, which is the largest division in Health and Human Services, and highlighted in particular impacts for our dental revenue. This is a program that is provided almost exclusively in the schools. And as you know, schools have not been in session. And when they do come back, we anticipate that providing dental is probably not going to be front and center for them this school year. So we are really anticipating that for the balance of this school year, we will not be in schools. And our estimated loss for current fiscal year in that is about $3 million. So you can see that huge dip. What we do know is that we anticipate this will bounce back in future years. And what I also think is important for the board and budget committee to know is that we have had a variety of federal offsets that have been able to come through. And so between those and reserves, coupled with real intensive efforts to contain costs, we are anticipating we will weather through that, but we certainly will have some level of deficit in our dental program that will impact the rest of the CHC as we move forward. Let's go to the next slide. Kind of the other version of that story is in our Human Services division, where we have had such a huge influx of one-time revenue this past year. And just to give you a sense of the scale of that, in the time since the board adopted our budget in July and passed supplemental number 2, the last adjustment to the budget, we've seen an increase of $17 million in our Human Services Fund. And that's a combination of rental assistance dollars, as well as impacts for housing support and energy assistance. Those are one-time dollars, which are incredibly important to the people who live in Lane County. And we're moving those out into the community, but we know that we can't expect those to continue at that same level into the future. So that links back a little bit to Alex's piece earlier about our priorities going into next legislative session to really secure ongoing funds to support the commitments that the board has, both in terms of goals and priorities, but also in terms of some very tangible commitments, such as the purchase of River Avenue, which we intend to repurpose when we no longer need it as a COVID recovery center, for a navigation center, or our commitments around supportive housing. We absolutely have to secure ongoing service dollars in order to maintain those services in the community. So those will be a priority for us going into the legislature. And also you see that reflected in our budget. Public health, clearly, we have had tremendous resources expended in response to COVID. We've spent about $2.6 million in the last 6 months, and those monthly costs continue to increase. We spent about $1 million in December on our COVID response. Again, we anticipate most or all of those will be covered by a combination of funds from the Oregon Health Authority, dollars that have been coming directly from the federal government or from the Fed CARES Act through the state. And then ultimately, we're prepared for reimbursement from FEMA for any expenses that remain unreimbursed when our emergency response is eventually finished. But when we prepare and present our budget, the public health budget is not going to look at all like it has looked in the past. So I want to prepare you for that piece. And then knowing that even when we officially shift from our critical public health response, we're going to continue to see impacts from COVID in public health really for years to come. And then if we go to that part of the department, both in terms of board priorities and community impacts, but also some budget pressures that I wanted to flag for you. Our medication-assisted treatment program has been growing over the last several years, as you know, in response to a very serious opiate pandemic in the community. What we have seen, however, as it collided with our COVID pandemic and we were unable to serve as many clients and certainly not do as much face-to-face work as we have done in the past, is we have seen an impact to our revenues in our medication-assisted treatment program. In 1920, we anticipate about $468,000 impact, and then in current year, about $303,000 impact. Again, those are lost revenues. We're able to make up some of that by federal aid and assistance that has come in as offsets for that. But we anticipate at the end of the year, we'll see certainly an impact in our MAT budget. Again, we have every reason to believe we'll be able to bounce back in future years. So we'll be tapping our reserves and other funding sources to cover that with the expectation that we'll need to build that back in the future. And then just the last two bullets on this slide actually directly relate back to Alex Kyler's presentation earlier. When we think about our behavioral health budget in general, and in particular that intersection with public safety and homelessness, that's in our budget, the forensics program is how we refer to that particular intersection, or our caseload that's mandated. So it's people who are required to get treatment because of their interaction with the public safety system or because they're under civil commitment. And the state historically has not funded those services to really meet the costs for that mandated caseload. So I know Alex is prepared to go into this session again to make our case about needing to have adequate funding for those services. And we'll have more information by the time we're in budget prep with the budget committee about that piece. And then finally, our state funding allocations. While I put that bullet here in behavioral health, it's really true across much of our department that is state funded. This policy debate at the state level about whether funds should continue to be allocated to counties as political subdivisions who are responsible for monitoring the system, whether those funds come to us to disperse in the community, or whether we have to compete for those funds, is a significant element for us, not only in behavioral health, but in human services and housing and other parts of the budget. So we'll be watching those as well. I think I pass it to Christine now.
Thank you. Good morning. This is Christine Moody. I'm the Lane County Budget and Financial Planning Manager. And I will just cover a few revenue sources that we refer to more as county level resources. They are used by some of our departments, but also go out to the community. So the ones that I'll highlight for you are Transient Room Tax. As would be expected, it has been impacted by COVID quite dramatically in some areas. So far this fiscal year, looking at the same period, we are about 23% down on that revenue. That is one that is used for our Lane Event Center, parks, but it's also external agencies like Traveling County, our rural communities, the Historical Museum that rely on that revenue. Car rental tax is another one that's seeing a large downturn. We're down quarter to quarter about 38%. Some of that, of course, being COVID. We also have had a bankruptcy with Hertz, which is one of our larger car rental agencies in our community. So we're seeing a larger impact with them also. Those funds are used by the discretionary general fund and then also parks. And then the other one I'll mention that I didn't list here just quickly is video lottery. And that with our bars and restaurants closed, the county receives video lottery funds, and they are down with the lag. We don't have a percentage on that yet, but we'll be watching that going forward. And that is all I have.
Okay, Chair, and the last one we have here, so you've heard now a fair amount of discussion about our revenues. And in the past several years, our revenues have been steadily growing. And so what it has allowed is an environment of managing our expenses so that if our revenues are growing at 3% a year, we need to manage our expenses to make sure that our expenses grow at that rate, or less so that we can pay for that. If that becomes out of whack, if our revenues are growing at 3% and our expenses are growing at 4 or 5%, well, there's your imbalance, or there's your structural imbalance where your revenues are now not covering the costs that you are obligated to pay. So in the last several years, our focus was really, okay, let's manage our internal expenses, these things like health insurance and PERS and debt and other internal costs, and keep the growth in those expenses smaller than they had been, so that the sort of steady increases in revenue would pay for those expenses. Now what we have, as I said at the beginning, we're in a period of cautious concern where you see a number, this isn't sort of isolated revenues, it's a number of different revenues impacted by different things. You see services that are dependent on enterprise fund operations, where the service delivering the service is required to collect the revenue in our CHCs and the MAT and those types of, and Lane Event Center. And then you see property taxes, Christine will talk a little bit more, that we're projecting flat, at least for a year, and maybe some growth after that, which I think is optimistic. So that's on the revenue side. We're seeing our revenues flatten while they've been at sort of a steady growth pace for several years, and we're in a sort of managing our expenses. We're now starting to see a flattening and a declining of many of our revenues, and so it puts us in a different place as it relates to our expenses. So we want to just have one slide here to touch on expenses. And again, this is just to flag areas that we are aware of that will create further pressure on expenses that are not already assumed. So these things are not included in our forecast going forward because they're sort of unknown at this point. So we're just flagging them to say, and many of these are good things, right? To say that these are things we want to be able to do, but they're things we need to understand are going to create pressure. First, pay equity, given the state's implementation of state legislation a couple years ago that looked at statewide organizations addressing pay equity issues. We've spent the better part of 18 to 24 months. We've brought on a consultant that is working with other local governments across the state to really dive deep. We've worked with all of our employees, and you'll hear more about this in the future. And that work is still being done to really assess and analyze where we have any issues of pay equity among classifications in the organization. And that work is still happening. Ultimately, we know there is going to be a cost. We don't know exactly what that cost is going to be, but ultimately there will need to be some adjustments made to address issues of pay equity. Those will need to be implemented, and they will come with a cost. We also know that we have every year we have contract negotiations, as we have 7 or 8 bargaining units in Lane County. We have 3 that are coming up, and I actually should say 4 in a sense. We have the prosecuting attorneys, primarily in the general fund, funded by the general fund. We have 2 AFSCME General and AFSCME nurses that are coming up, that are spread really throughout all of our funds. And then we have our parole and probation officers that are funded out of our parole and probation office. So those labor contracts, and we've done a great job in the last several years of making sure that we maintain market competitiveness. I'll touch on this in a minute, and keeping our, reducing turnover, keeping hiring and retaining quality talent. So we want to continue the investment in a high quality workforce. That will come with cost. Our PERS rates still dependent. Well, we've done everything we can do as a county to invest in opportunities to try to stabilize or reduce to some degree the increased costs in PERS rates. We have hit historic market returns in the past several years. And so that the uncertainty of what investment returns and overall PERS rates will be are still at play. And then finally, health insurance. I mentioned the incredible work that's happened throughout this entire organization, including our employees, to all participate in wellness, not just carrying around our health insurance card when we are sick and go to the doctor, but really when we wake up every morning going, my health is my responsibility. And so I need to take ownership of that. And that's I think an ethic that we have all embraced in this organization, not just caring for people when they get sick, but helping support our employees being well in all instances. So that's been really positive. Our net claim expenses continue to grow. And so we have seen about an 8.8% growth in net claim expenses. We think that's still trending in a positive direction had we not have made a lot of the changes that have been made, but there's pressure there. And again, our wellness clinic is in employees embracing that is a big part of that. So I will say that, our goal here going forward it has been to sustain our workforce and expand it through targeted investments that we talked about. We've expanded our workforce by nearly 260 FTEs in the past 5 budgets. Now, our goal really needs to be, in my estimation, maintaining that for a period of time, right? Let's manage these financial challenges that we have ahead of us. Let's make sure that any obligations we take on, we have the ability to pay for moving forward. So I'm going to pause there, Chair. This is the end of sort of that section, and then we'll move into the themes and the general fund. So if you want to take a few minutes and ask for questions from commissioners on this section, we have some time to do that.
Well, I'm looking at our agenda, and you actually have saved us. Thank you. We were running late there. Commissioners, are there any questions at all? That was a lot. Commissioner Trieger?
Still checking where my camera, there we go.
I know, thank you for doing that, Commissioner Trieger.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair Burney. Ms. Gaffney, I don't know if this is really the right setting for this, but I'm curious about, so maybe it's just flagging it for another conversation. On top of COVID and long haulers, when you mention in particular the dental clinics through the schools, dental care through the schools, and additionally, of course, people who've lost their employment-related health care and health insurance due to the pandemic, whether there's some calculations in anticipation of increased cost of providing care, because delayed care often becomes more expensive care. So I don't know if that's part of the calculus and projecting forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair Burney and Commissioner Trieger. I think as a community, we absolutely need to walk through that calculus. I think it's been interesting in response to the pandemic. We've certainly seen our numbers of people who qualify for Medicaid go up. So I think people have had the payer, but certainly the ability to actually go into the provider's office to get care, or the choice to postpone those preventive or screening tests, I think absolutely is going to have an impact on demand for services moving through and the community costs of care. I don't know that we will see that impact in Lane County's budget per se because of the services we provide, but I think as a community, we absolutely are going to see pent-up demand for care, and unfortunately, I would imagine higher needs for situations that could have been prevented or addressed earlier.
Thank you very much.
Commissioner Bozovich, I noticed your hand.
Thank you. A quick comment going back to the community corrections and parole and probation for folks. There was a time study done last year that showed that we really should be funding that statewide by an additional $50 million at minimum. And that money was never allocated last year. So we're underfunding, and now they're talking about an additional cuts in that budget. So that 3.4 million in cuts in those programs is not even taking into account how much the cost of supervision's grown, because we've gone from tail and jail type parole and probation, supervision to restorative justice model that cost a lot more money to implement. And I just want to remind folks, that's not really showing up in those numbers, that lack of funding that we failed to get in the last legislature when the denial of quorum happened. I had a quick question for Christine. The TRT reductions, you said we're down 23%, but aren't there commitments in our TRT fund that we cannot reduce, like our commitment to the City of Florence for their updates that they did to 126 and 101, and also some of our bond payments on the event center, et cetera, so that impact's going to be borne more heavily on places where we're using TRT for operational budget?
Well, the one place that you would see that, you're right, Commissioner Bozovich, on the Florence payment, that's $200,000 a year. So, you know, in the relative scheme of our amount of TRT, that is a smaller amount. We do have limited reserves in that capital portion that was part of that calculation. So I'm not concerned about making that payment. You're right, we're obligated there. Lane Event Center is where those bond payments will come from. So those have always come off the top of their allocations. So that impact is directly felt by Lane Event Center. So that is part of why you're seeing those charts that Mr. Hurley showed you on their revenue impacts. So that's being taken into account there. But you are correct that the operating funds are getting hit a little harder.
Other questions? Seeing none. Mr. Mokrahysky, I believe you now are going to talk about themes for the coming year.
Yeah, so we just have one slide here, and I want to take a minute, and this is really just to, try to provide for the board and for our leadership and the employees and the public who are watching some snapshot into what are we thinking right now? What's informing kind of the thought process, high level, around the construction of next year's budget. You've heard a lot about the numbers and revenue challenges and expense pressures. And I will say, the budget is my view is always, this is the largest policy statement that we make in the given year. It's $770+ million in taxpayer resources that's spent on critical services. And it really is a reflection of the priorities of the board, of our organization, of our community. So I want to just touch on sort of some of the things, and I want to start by acknowledging, everyone says this, right? We reflect on the last year, how hard the last year has been. It's all relative, I think, because it depends on where you've been sitting. And we know certainly for local residents who are unemployed, for businesses who have gone under, had to lay off employees, for people who are at risk of becoming unhoused or become unhoused, any of those financial instability, the people with childcare, all of these issues, the challenges are really severe in our community, across the state, and across the nation. Our goal is, so my comments here are really what we have said is we're going to support our community, and we exist as an organization to provide services to the community. So maintaining employment in Lane County is as much about supporting our employees as it is about saying we want to support our community when they're most at risk and most challenged. So we have been very explicit from the beginning of this at trying to engage with our employees, listen to the concerns that they have, try to accommodate and support the needs. And we've said explicitly, I've said, I don't want to have to lay anybody off as a result of that. We're going to do everything we can do to not to have that be the action of last resort. And thankfully, we have not had to have any layoffs in the past year, even though you've seen the charts of declining revenue, and there is a lot of pressure, and we are at risk of being unbalanced in a number of areas, and we are at risk of having to spend reserves to balance some of these areas. And if we need to, my view is we do that in the midst of an emergency to be able to maintain service levels as long as we can sustain it over the long term. So I want to just reflect and offer appreciation to our employees. You saw the 1,700 plus employees in our organization working. I mean, we don't have time to go through all of the different service areas. People are working in different ways from different locations in ways they didn't imagine. I tell the story that on March 10th, I met with Mike Coles and his team of around 100 employees from assessment and taxation. And I met actually with the president of AFSCME. It was the president of AFSCME and I that were meeting with A&T employees and talking about, just how we're working and going. This was on March 10th, about a week before everything shut down. And an employee asked me at that time, an employee from A&T said, have you thought about remote work? Is that something that we could do for our workforce? And my answer on March 10th was, maybe in some targeted areas we could do that, but we just, we've we don't really know how we would do that because we have such a diverse workforce and people working all the, or think about health, all this. This was my answer on March 10th. Fast forward a week later on March 17th, we sent everyone home. Not, about 2/3 of our workforce, half to 2/3 of our workforce, we found a way through the grit and resilience of our team, technology folks and HR folks and partnership with our unions and our leadership in the organization, our employees, we had to do that. And our employees responded and they came to us and said, can you do this? Can you help with TM? Can you do, what about childcare and homeschooling? So it has been a year that I'm really proud of the entire organization, bottom up, and how people have responded. And it's been challenging and stressful. People have dealt with remote work. People have dealt with still coming into work and doing their jobs in the same way that they have. Folks being at home has been needed to allow the people that need to come and work on site to be able to do so safely. Childcare issues and homeschooling issues have been a challenge for people who have dependents that need care, school-age children. We've had listening sessions. We've developed an employee resource group that's focused on parents with school-age children or dependents in need so that they have the support needed. We've provided additional technology through offering trainings and monitorings and webcams so people can effectively work remotely in those settings. We have enhanced the opportunity for time management. This is our PTO, vacation and sick leave, for employees to be able to sell that time if they need an influx of resources because maybe their partner is out of work or they have additional expenses for childcare. We've also allowed, if you don't need that, you can make donations of your vacation and sick leave time so that employees who need to take time off because they're at risk of contracting COVID or they get sick and need to isolate and quarantine. We've made childcare investments. We continue our daily communications with employees. So it has not been perfect. But I will say that I'm really proud of the way that everyone in our organization has responded, that it's largely been a collaborative effort, and we've shared information and worked together with a focus on delivering passionate services to the community, on connecting with each other, and on solving challenges. So I also want to make a comment about, our focus for so many years here has been on creating stability in the workforce, right? So we can deliver services to the community. So we have a workforce we can recruit and retain the best talent because our ability to provide the highest level quality services to the community is largely dependent not only on the resources we have, but the quality of people that we hire and retain and the extent to which we invest in those people to train and develop them so that they can become their best. And so when I started in 2014, our turnover was pushing 20%. We had vacancies in a lot of different places. We had struggled. And we had gone through just a really tough period of time in this organization of having to reduce expenses, lay people off. So we were dealing with, we didn't have a public health manager. We didn't have a behavioral health manager. 3 of our 5 appointed department directors were vacant. This sort of permeated throughout that there was a lot of challenges as it relates to the workforce. You now fast forward, and because of the commitment of the board, our leadership, and employees throughout the organization, we've created this stability that we have now south of 10% turnover annually. Lane County has now become an employer of choice where we look at, yes, we still struggle with some really difficult to recruit positions, but more and more we're able to hire, particularly for those more difficult to recruit positions, people of great talent who are choosing to come here and people who are staying in the organization and in the community because there is a stability, there's a commitment to our people, and we want that to continue. So I just want to offer a thank you and a recognition to all of our employees across the organization who I love the language that Commissioner Buck used in her State of the County, grit and determination and resilience. It really has been emblematic of the people in this organization in the past year. And so that gives me a lot of hope. That gives me hope. That gives us all hope for the future, that because we have great people, we've committed to our people, that we are going to be able to get through this time. So our focus will continue to be on that resiliency for our organization and for our community, so that we can continue to respond to the needs of our community, because those are going to be great even when we get through this pandemic. So our continued response and recovery to COVID-19 will be a focus. I want to also just comment that on our emergency response effort, you've heard from Karen Gaffney and more recently Steve Adams and the emergency response team, our public health team, our health and human services team that has, for 12 months now, just powered through this pandemic, done an incredible job. We have also had people from every department and every level of the organization outside of health and human services that have also supported that effort. So it's a great example of how this organization pulls together. It's one of the reasons I love working in this organization. I've worked in a lot of counties in different places, and there can be turf battles and fighting and parochialism, and here people roll up their sleeves and say, what do we need to do for the greater good of the organization and the community? We saw that also with the wildfire response and recovery. I mean, it's unbelievable. When you saw in the State of the County video, it could have been so much worse if not for the response of our emergency management folks, of our public safety officials, of our public works crews, and our community members that got out quick and helped people get out. And so yes, property damage was significant, but loss of life was not. And that is a testament to the incredible work of people in this organization and our partners in the community. We've had a real focus in the last several years on equity, and that continues to be. So we have sort of moved into equity 2.0, and our goal is here to continue to move into equity 3.0, which is just a continued evolution of that investment and to further embed our equity work into all of our decision making. That's really where we're headed. And so, I think everyone who's been involved in our equity work really want to see us continue to make more investments in supporting that work being implemented and being embedded and supported throughout our organization. So equity, access, inclusion will continue to be a focus and a theme, and I think an area of growth that we want to support. Data analytics is another, and that goes along with equity in part, because in our equity work, we really need to understand and analyze information about our people in the organization, how we're recruiting and retaining, and how we're working with our existing workforce and recruiting new folks, and then our community. How are we responding with services and supporting everyone in our community? Data analytics is also about how we get the best out of the service, the people and the services that we can provide. So it's about being smarter in our approach, being more focused and more effective in the delivery of services and responding to the needs of the community. And so I'm giving you broad themes here, but data analytics is definitely something that we have a desire to make more of an investment from a countywide perspective. Done a great job in health and human services of really investing in a robust data analytics program there, and we want to bring that to the entire organization. Affordable housing will continue to be a theme. The board recently approved our Affordable Housing Action Plan, and that will continue to be, as the board has talked about here, and several of you have commented about the additional pressure and the influx of people and the increase in housing costs that is creating for our community, the lack of available land to build in, and the impact that has on affordable housing and responding to the needs of those that need affordable housing, as well as those that are at risk of losing their housing. And then finally, we mentioned, I think yesterday and again this morning, the strategic plan. Our strategic plan will expire at the end of 2021. So I want us to be thinking about this year as really a year of transformation, of how do we take this great, growth and stability that we've created, how do we maintain that, and how do we pivot, and how do we take that strong foundation and leverage that to meet the needs of our organization, our community in the future. Okay, I'm done. So I can pause, and I think we're on time here. If you have any questions on that, happy to answer those. Otherwise, Christine Moody will jump into the general fund.
Questions, comments for Steve? I see none. Christine, it's all yours.
Thank you. I'll just go over a little bit of the initial general fund forecast here. But for those watching the meeting who maybe are not as familiar with the general fund, I'll just give a little bit of history very quickly. So the general fund is our primary operating fund. It's the most discretionary source of revenue that the Board of Commissioners has to use where needed. And so I've showed you some of the activities and the revenues in there. We've got our property taxes being the largest revenue source, any secure rural schools related to the general fund, timber revenue, recording fees, and election fees. I'm showing you a chart there on the right of where those funds are allocated in the current adopted budget, with the predominance being in the public safety area. Next slide. So the history of the fund, the most recent history that you've heard Steve talk about some this morning, the decades of budget reductions that occurred due to the loss of timber revenue in the general fund, the Secure Rural Schools Fund, beginning in the 1980s. Then we also had property tax reform in the mid-1990s that resulted in that very low permanent property tax rate that you heard about this morning. So prior to fiscal year 15-16, the county was doing the best it could, but was also spending one-time revenue on ongoing operations. So expenditures were consistently exceeding our ongoing revenue. Things like PERS rates, medical insurance were causing those expenses to grow at much faster than the revenue that was coming in. Next slide. So beginning in fiscal year 15-16, we started focusing on making sure that the fund was structurally balanced, not just balanced under budget law, which is resources equaling requirements, but looking at our ongoing revenue and our ongoing expenses to make sure that those were balanced. We stopped spending money on one-time or operating money on the one-time expenses. We looked to our internal expenses to reduce as much as we could in the areas that we could. We prepaid debt when possible. And then going self-funded in the medical insurance has controlled that premium growth that kept causing those expenses to grow so fast. So structural balance was first achieved in the general fund in fiscal year 17-18. Next slide. So to get into the forecast, this initial forecast that I've completed prior to departments entering their budgets, property taxes being the largest piece of this change since the last time you would have seen the forecast. The information I'm receiving from the assessor is that he is projecting a flat property tax growth for 21-22. And then I've showed you the percentages there in the out years of the 5 years of the forecast. The graph that you're seeing is the difference between the 2021 forecast that I prepared for property taxes and then this new one with the lower amount. The red bar being what occurs with property taxes when we have a 0% flat for 21-22. It's about a $1.6 million decrease compared to the prior forecast, and over 5 years, it's over $8 million. So just wanting to show that graph that this is something that becomes systemic in the forecast anytime we have a revenue that dips. And so if that forecast does end up coming to pass, that is what this is all based on, is that flat amount. For timber revenue, I am holding in the general fund that amount at about $3 million, which is the amount that we would expect from timber revenue, or if SRS were renewed. As we know, there's no current renewal in the general fund, or the road fund is the other fund that would receive those funds. Recording revenue, as you've heard, the residential market is so strong. Our deeds and records recording revenue is really strong right now as the refinances and those deeds being recorded with the low interest rates, but how long that lasts will still be determined. And then I'll just mention parking revenue. While it's not a huge revenue source in the general fund, it's definitely one we watch the impact from COVID and individuals not being in the downtown Eugene area. And then of course, we already had the issue of the transition of the land to the market district. So reducing the amount of parking that was available to produce revenue for the general fund. Next slide. On the expenses side, we have wages being the largest percent of expenses in the general fund because it's primarily service oriented. Continued growth there due to market adjustments and cost of living increases. Our benefits, as already mentioned this morning, medical claims per employee are increasing July to November compared to last year. That has so far been offset over the last year or two with increasing FTE and retirements, but whether that continues enough to offset those medical claims increasing will still be determined. And then we will shift our internal medical rate charges to our departments. We look to the 3 plans that we offer our employees and make sure that we're collecting revenue that offsets the expenses related to those plans. So we will shift rates within the budget, but they should stay fairly flat for the 21-22. And then 21-22 is the beginning of a state biennium, which means that our PERS employer rate is being changed. It is increasing. We will start to see, though, the side accounts that the commissioners deposited funds into will also go into effect. So that's that 1.5% offset to that rate that will help us for the next 10 years. And then material and services, when we prepare the forecast, we look to the Oregon economic forecast, the December forecast, to see what they are seeing for Western CPI growth over the next 5 years. And so I've listed those there for you. And next slide. So the bottom line on the forecast is that 21-22 initially looks stable. That could change based on what I receive from departments and their revenue. So those unknowns that have been mentioned today definitely raise concern. Slowdown in property tax being the largest of those. The wages and PERS rates, along with the future for the 5-year forecast of the economic recovery and how fast that rebounds will determine how we look over the next 4 years. So the forecast will be verified as departments enter their budgets through the proposed budget development process. And the next time that you will see an update will be in May when we present to the Budget Committee.
Thank you very much.
All right, so
I'm sorry.
Any questions?
I think, Chair, if you wanted to take questions, we have a few minutes. What I'm asking for is maybe about 10 minutes to just do the recap from the beginning that we missed for the video for folks who didn't see that. So we probably have a good 5, 10, 15 minutes for, I know we have one more slide on the calendar, but if you want to take a few minutes for any additional questions.
I did not see any, but maybe I missed it. Are there any commissioners that would like to ask any questions at this time? Commissioner, excuse me, Vice Chair Farr.
Thank you, Chair Bernie. Not a question, Chair Bernie, but for you, Ms. Mokrzycki, just a comment regarding the structural balance that you almost brush over when you talk about it. You don't almost brush over it, you dig into it a little bit. Many of those who are new to the process or have been watching from the outside, it's difficult to understand the difficulty and the amount of work that you and staff put into achieving that structural balance. You cover it in a few sentences. At some point, I would love to see it more of an outline, specific areas that we addressed the last 5 or 6 years, 7 years, since you came on board and since staff solidified and became such a well-oiled working machine. I'd love to see an outline on that at some point so we can see it and understand that it's not just a few sentences worth of work, it is years and years of toil to get us to that point. Thank you, Mr. Mokrzycki. Thank you, Chair.
And I can touch on that in the recap, Commissioner. I'll touch on a few of those things, but you're right. And I think appreciate you saying that. And I think it's a good reminder that the really important long-term sustainable work doesn't happen overnight. It's incremental, it's kind of steady, diligent investments that are made year over, day over day, week over week, month over month, year over year. And we stick to those things. And then over time, you start to see, the fruits from that come to bear. And so it has been started. And I think what we want now, again, the message here is let's try to maintain that, right? Like, so we have some revenue challenges we're going into. We're going to have to really be mindful of the expense side of the budget and anything that you know, the extent of the growth in expenses can very quickly sort of set that structural imbalance out of whack.
Any other commissioners would like to ask questions or weigh in at this time? I would like to simply say that last year, really from the sidelines of vice chair to observe Chair Buck and Mr. Mokrahysky and the leadership of his staff spent about 80 hours a week. That was not anticipated, even though work is slow and steady, was really inspirational for me. For what that's worth, I've often been on the sidelines a critic of certain bureaucracies and governments and operations, and I cannot be that way as it relates to the commitment to people, processes, and I don't just mean the county employees, which is obviously what we're talking about with the county budget, but I also mean the most vulnerable among us, those businesses that have been suffering among us, and I really just want to acknowledge that also, because it seems like this is the place. So thank you all. I guess it's time to move on.
I'll just briefly go over the calendar here. This will look familiar to you, no change in the months where things occur. So today, starting with this leadership team meeting, budget kickoff with our internal departments will begin on January 19th. Departments will have about a month to submit, prepare their budgets to the central budget office, where we review and validate. And then our departments will meet with the county administrator as your budget officer to develop a proposed budget. In April, we will prepare the documents based on that budget, and then the budget committee will first begin to be involved in May with those budget committee meetings. And then approval from the board and adoption will occur in June. So no change there. And then this initial budget direction is just reiterating what's already been stated today, but we don't have an extension of secure rural schools, so that impacts how we budget for timber harvest in the general fund. Our personnel, our practice and policy is to include only already approved cost of living or market increases, in addition to merit increases. We also budget, we take into account a vacancy variance at the beginning of our budget process to make sure we're not budgeting for 100% employment. That is a big piece of our structural balance in the general fund. And then on the benefit side, we will shift to those internal plan rates. As I mentioned, the PERS employer rate increase will occur, and we'll ask general fund services to limit a growth to the CPI as indicated in the Oregon forecast where if possible. Those goals to structurally balance all funds are still the focus, and that is a county policy. And we'll continue to meet the 20% minimum reserve in the general fund and then maintain service levels. So with that, I think I'm done with my comments, but I don't know if Steve has any further or if you want to go on to your wrap up.
I think I would, Chair, if, unless you have, there are additional questions or comments right now. I'll just do a quick recap. I'll ask Tanya if you could go to the front there. I'm going to do this quickly. Go to the front of the presentation. So this is for, because we weren't able to record the first 25 minutes of the meeting. We're just going to do a quick recap, and then we'll share what we shared with the group here. And then we should end with extra time. So I started just by sharing Commissioner Buck in her State of the County, was, in my opinion, spot on in talking about how we entered 2020, that we entered in really solid financial position. And I would say that we entered probably in some of the best financial position that Lane County's been in decades. All of our funds structurally balanced, reserves meeting all of our board policies, having increased our and invested in new services and additional employment, having raised our bond rating, and then of course, as Commissioner Buck said in the State of the County, 2020 had different plans for us, and so we've gone from the beginning of 2020 to now the beginning of 2021 from cautious optimism to cautious concern. And you can, this slide here just talks about the The process and sort of where we're at in the process is highlighted. This is January 6th, the beginning of our budget kickoff with an overview and direction from the board. We'll have budgets will enter their departments will enter their budgets. We will then review, the county administrator and budget office will review department budgets with the departments. County administrator will propose the budget in late April. The budget committee, comprised of the commissioners and 5 residents that are appointed, will meet in May. The budget committee will approve the budget by mid to late May, and then the board of commissioners will adopt the budget in mid-June. Next slide. This is sort of standard information, but I pointed out on this slide that we now have 1,736 full-time equivalent employees in Lane County, and that is up nearly 260 positions in the past 5 fiscal years. And I noted that of those 260 positions, not surprisingly, about 60% of them came in the health and human services area, because we've had the Medicaid expansion, the growth in our clinics, the need to hire additional staff to deliver those additional services. So with many of those positions, we've had additional revenue that has come in to pay for those. But about 40% of those positions, over 100 positions that have been added in the past 5 fiscal years, have come outside of health and human services and are in areas like public safety for the sheriff and the DA, and parole and probation, assessment and taxation, and other areas. And that really has been the result of our efforts to stabilize our budget, structurally stabilize our budget, and become on more solid financial footing. So you see our total adopted budget there at $773 million for the current fiscal year, and the 10 departments that we have in the county to organize all of the different services and work that we do. Next slide. This slide we show every year, and it's hard to read, but it's basically list from top to bottom of the 32 counties in Lane County in Oregon, and it's ranking those 32 counties in order of from lowest to highest of permanent property tax rate. So in some sense, from a service standpoint, you could view low as not good. Because it means, our permanent property tax rate that Lane County collects for Lane County is the 7th lowest of all the counties. And that's because we didn't need a large property tax rate, because we were supported by so much funding from the timber industry and logging on federal lands because of all the federal lands we have. So our permanent property tax rate is $1.28, equal to the same rate that Deschutes County has. And we've circled here the 5 counties that Lane County typically compares itself to. We look at comparables for wages and benefits and services. We look to Deschutes County, Jackson County, Washington, Clackamas, and Marion. But if you dig a little bit deeper, you'll see, while Deschutes County has the same permanent property tax rate, they have another permanent rate for public safety. And that ranges between $1.40 and $1.80. So if you add that permanent rate to their general permanent rate, they're actually where Clackamas is. And Lane County is getting pretty lonely at the bottom of that list with that really low permanent property tax rate. The other counties, you see Washington County also has a permanent rate of an additional permanent rate of 64 cents on top of their general rate for public safety, and Clackamas County has a 72-cent additional rate. So these other counties that we compare ourselves to are really no way, while we compare ourselves to them as it relates to, how much we compensate and how we deliver services, we don't have we're not even on the same planet in terms of the revenue that we collect to support those things. So it's an important thing to keep in mind. You go to the next slide, which depicts the other side of this coin. So one side is our rate is being artificially low because we had all that federal revenue, and then in the mid-90s, we have state property tax caps go into effect. We can't raise our rate unless we create a new district, which has not happened here in Lane County. And so the federal money that we depended on to maintain those services, because our rate is so low, has declined by 93% since 2001. So we went from $40 million a year in 2001 down to a few million, like $3 to $4 million a year. In the general fund and the road fund. And so that just, wiped $40 million off the books. And what happens? We are left with what we have, which is several years, several decades actually, of decline in services. And you can go to the next slide. Really, there's no structural fix to that, other than to create another district, a permanent district that allows this steady, dedicated rate to support some of those critical functions like public safety that you see in Deschutes and Clackamas and Washington County. Or we hope the federal government, sweeps in and says, here you go, here's more money that you didn't expect, that is committed to you year after year after year, that you can invest in new services. Either one of those is really difficult. So we've been focused in Lane County over the past several years at saying, let's manage our financial house, let's get our financial house in order. And our revenues have steadily grown, right? At 3%, something like that, 3% a year. And so what we've said is let's manage our expenses to stay at that. Commissioner Farr said, what does that mean, the structural balance? What kind of work does that require? It's as simple as saying our revenues that we collect have to equal the amount of money that we spend on an annual basis. That's as simple. Now, actually accomplishing that is the challenging part. So we've said structurally balance all of our funds, build our reserves so that we can handle something like a pandemic, a once in a lifetime, once in 100 years pandemic, something like a once in a lifetime catastrophic fire that wipes out hundreds of homes and businesses. So Lane County was as primed as we could have been to meet the challenges of 2020. And the great work that has been put in over several years really set us up for being able to meet the needs of the community in this last year and going forward. We also, had an intentional effort. Let's build our credit rating so we can lower the cost to borrow money to meet the needs that we have to meet. And we've seen that steady increase from 10 years ago, a AA3, to today, a AA1, which is the highest rating we've ever had, second highest rating that Moody's. That's a reflection of how the third-party credit agencies look at Lane County, and they say, is this a good bet that they're going to pay their obligations? And they're saying, yes, they're going to meet their obligations because they're responsibly managing resources. They're not spending reserves on operating costs. They're being responsible about how they do that. So, the focus again, let's try to maintain our employment, maintain our services, and then strategically invest in areas that can really impact the community. We talked about in the DA's office, and Alex Kyler mentioned, how critical that is to get to prosecute those lower level crimes so that we can get people diverted into supervision and services, lower recidivism, increase our revenue. So we've done those types of investments that are really crucial. The board more recently in late 2020 investing in a 5-year plan for rural patrol that really went without a lot of fanfare, but we need to take a minute and just say how historic that was probably the biggest, other than the jail levy, which was the voters saying, here's some additional revenue to shore up correction services, the first big influx of resources for a short period of time for us to be able to meet some needs in the community. And then to Commissioner Farr's question, well, what are those things we've done? How have we gotten to structural balance? It's things like focus. We've said, how do we maintain, manage, and reduce expenses that don't reduce our employment, so we don't have to lay people off. We don't have to cut a service to the public, maintain our services and do that. So we don't want to cut a benefit for folks, and we don't want to cut a service for the public. We don't want to put people out of work. Let's manage our health insurance costs in creative ways. Let's pay off our debt early and refinance our debt. Let's invest in the PERS side account and manage our PERS rates. Let's look at our internal costs like fleet and facilities and technology expenses. Let's manage our workers' comp liability. Let's look at our vacant positions. And if we don't need a vacant position, let's eliminate that. And so this is what I would say is just smart budgeting. Budgeting is basically math. 1 + 1 has to equal 2, right? So it's how do we go about and being smart about the approaches that we make. And go to the next slide. And the last two here are pretty straightforward. We talk about these often. Our strategic plan, which the board this year talked about this 2021 being a year of continued resilience, recovery, and transformation. Let's take this foundation we've built, let's maintain it, and let's use it and leverage it into meeting the needs of our community going forward. So we will keep, our purpose to improve lives, our lenses of looking at all decisions around, can we pay for this? Do we actually have the money to pay for this over the long term? How does this decision, this investment, this decision impact everybody in our community? And what partners have we brought to the table to solve this challenge? Do we have everyone we need? Because we can't go it alone. That's what the lenses are about, viewing those decisions through those lenses and thinking about that as we make decisions. And then our core behaviors, which are so critical, how our employees act when they're at their best, a passion to serve, a drive to connect, and a focus on solutions. And then finally, the board's strategic priorities, which the board will have a chance to revise or change or do what you want with in this coming year. But we've said a safe, healthy county, vibrant communities, which is really 3 E's: environment, equity, and economy is what falls in vibrant communities. Robust infrastructure and our people and partnerships are the 4 things that the board has said, these are most important to the community. And this is what we want our organization focused on. And then all these planning efforts, that where the rubber kind of meets the road is how we take the board's vision and priorities and then say, how do we develop plans to actually get this in motion? And so you see all of these public safety plans and community health improvement plans, transportation and homelessness and economic development and equity and capital improvements, climate action, community benefits, all of it, and many more that we're continue to invest in and that continue to be the roadmap to achieve the strategic priorities and goals that the board has established. So that was the recap from the beginning. We'll stop here and thank you all. Chair, I'll turn it over to you for any additional questions, comments, and wrap up.
Well, it's 10:55. We've gone through the agenda. Our time to adjourn is 11. We've had the opportunity to hit everything and the county overview twice. We've learned budget math, which is 1 + 1 = 2. We now understand the 3 E's. Are there any final questions before commissioners with their busy schedules move to their next meetings? Commissioner Bozovich?
Just a quick question. It's something I don't expect an answer, but maybe in writing later. We talked a lot about all sorts of various places our revenue is dropping or is projected to drop, but nowhere was there kind of like a totaling of what we're seeing across the board in the way of projected decrease in either projected revenue or decrease in real revenue. We've got property taxes that we're going to stay flat, which was like a 1.6 million. We had the community corrections and JRI, which was 3.4 million. We talked about TRT, car rental, video lottery, and then gas tax revenues. If there's some way of kind of putting that all together and trying to just give an idea of what are we talking about, my quick math has us up over about 7 or 8 million in decrease without the car rental tax. I mean, without the gas tax, because I don't know what that dollar amount was. But you know, I was just real quick going through the last adopted budget to see what the totals were for TRT and car rental tax and video lottery revenues, and it's a pretty significant amount. If those things are down 25 to 40%, yeah, I just kind of want to get an idea what's the hole we're looking at in the upcoming budget cycle.
Chair Bernie, Commissioner Bozovich, really good question. And you'll see more of that as we move further into the process, and certainly with the proposed budget, we'll propose a balanced budget to you. The question will be, how will it be balanced? There's a lot of work that needs to happen as departments enter their budget. You saw on that calendar, here's our first step, leadership team, and the next step is we meet with departments, give them instructions, they will enter their budgets. So much information comes from that, from the department budgets. When they enter their budgets, we'll know more detail about those pieces. I think today what we're doing is flagging for you. It's kind of a sneak peek, like a little glimpse into what we're seeing right now from what we know. So we could throw numbers out, but we haven't done that because we need more information, frankly, to give you a good assessment of where we're at. And I don't want to paint the picture the sky is falling, right? I also don't want to paint the picture that it's sunny and blue outside. It's what I've characterized this as cautious concern that we need to have. So you'll know more about kind of the details of how all of that shakes out as we get further into the process.
We've got a couple of minutes. Are there any other questions or comments? Well, let me just say that, Lori, I hope you don't mind my saying this, but I want to thank Commissioner Trieger for giving me a tutorial as we were going through this. It's allowed me to see and manage this meeting better. And I want to say that I don't know if the rest of you have heard one common theme, which was that Chair Buck, you did an amazing job last year, and your footsteps will be impossible to follow, but I'll do my best. With that, and Mr. Mokrahajski, as I texted you, I thought some of what you said was inspirational, and now the rubber's going to hit the road with this budget committee, and we're going to see how we move this forward. With that, if I may, unless there's objection, it's 11 a.m. Good morning. We are adjourned.